In 1971, a company in Chicago put a stoneware pot inside a metal jacket with a heating element wrapped around it and sold it as a bean cooker. Within 4 years, there was one on the counter of nearly every working woman's kitchen in America, and it had almost nothing to do with beans. It was the first appliance ever built for a woman who was not going to be home at 4 o'clock. And it arrived in exactly the decade she stopped being home at 4 o'clock. 10 million of them sold before the 70s were out. My name is Ruth Mae Callahan, and I want to be plain about what that pot actually did, because it is not what the advertisement said. It did not make cooking easier. It made cheap meat edible. 8 hours of wet heat at a low temperature is the only thing on this earth that turns a piece of chuck or a shoulder or a shank, the cuts nobody with money would buy, into something that falls apart on a fork. A woman with a Crockpot could buy the worst cut in the case on a Monday and put a Sunday dinner on the table on a Wednesday. That is the whole story of this appliance, and every single recipe on this list is a version of it. 25 of them, most not cooked in this country in 40 years. Let me show you. Before we start, understand the arithmetic she was working with. In 1973, chuck roast ran about $1.10 a pound, while a sirloin ran better than $2. Round steak, shank, neck bones, and shoulder were all in that same cheap band, and every one of them is tough because it is muscle that worked. Working muscle is full of connective tissue, and connective tissue is the thing that turns into gelatin if you hold it wet at a low heat for long enough. Fast heat makes it seize and go like rope. Slow heat makes it melt. That is the entire science of this pot. And no advertisement in that decade ever explained it, because the point was to sell an appliance, not to teach a technique. There is a second thing that pot did which nobody talks about, and it may matter more than the meat. It let a woman leave the house. Before it, a slow-cooked dinner meant somebody stayed within earshot of a stove for 6 hours, and that somebody was always her. A pot that could be left on a counter in an empty kitchen all day safely changed what a working mother could put on a table without giving up the wage. Every one of these recipes is really a recipe for time, and the meat is just what it happened to be spent on. And one warning that belongs at the front, because it is the mistake I see most. Low is not a weaker setting than high. Low and high both climb to roughly the same final temperature. High just gets there faster. So a recipe that runs 8 hours on low and 4 on high is not two different recipes, it is the same one. And the long, slow version is nearly always the better one, because the connective tissue needs hours at temperature rather than heat. If a pot roast of yours has ever come out tough, that is almost certainly why. It was not undercooked. It was cooked too fast. Number 1, pot roast. A chuck roast, an onion, carrots, potatoes, a cup of water or coffee, 8 hours on low. That is it. And the coffee is not a gimmick. A cup of leftover morning coffee poured over a chuck roast darkens the gravy and cuts the fat in a way water cannot. And half the women in this country were doing it in 1973 without ever writing it down. The rule that matters is that you do not lift the lid. Every time you lift it, you lose 20 minutes of heat, and the whole method depends on the pot never dropping temperature. The other rule is where you put the vegetables. Potatoes and carrots go in the bottom, under the meat, not around it on top. They cook slower than the beef does, and the bottom of that pot is the hottest part of it. Every roast that comes out with perfect meat and hard carrots was loaded in the wrong order, and that is the whole reason, not the recipe. Number 2, beef and barley soup. Neck bones or shank in the bottom, barley, an onion, carrots, water to cover, all day on low, Shank was one of the cheapest things at any butcher counter, and it carried more flavor than anything twice its price, because the bone and the marrow do the work of a stock you would otherwise have to make separately. Barley cost pennies and swelled to 3 times its size, which is exactly what a woman feeding 6 wanted out of a grain. Ask a butcher for shank today, and half of them will look at you sideways, because the cut mostly leaves the counter now as ground beef. It is the same piece of the animal that made this soup in 1973, and it is still one of the cheapest things in the case if you ask for it by name. Number 3, Swiss steak. Round steak dredged in flour, layered with onion and canned tomatoes, and left the whole day. The flour on the meat is what thickens the sauce as it goes, so there is no separate gravy step at the end. Round steak in that decade was under $1, and it is a cut that is genuinely inedible, cooked fast. This one dish converted more American families to that appliance than any other. The name has nothing whatever to do with Switzerland. Swissing is an old term for rolling or pounding cloth flat, and it came to mean beating a tough steak thin, which is what the butcher did to it before it was ever sold. A great many people cooking this dish for 30 years never knew that, and it tells you the name arrived from the trade rather than from a kitchen. Number 4, chicken and dumplings. A whole cut-up bird, water, and onion, celery, all day, and then dumpling dough dropped on top for the last 40 minutes, with the lid back on so they steam rather than boil. A whole chicken was cheaper by a wide margin than any part of one sold separately, and it still is. The dumplings must sit on top of the liquid, not in it. Push them under, and you get paste. A whole bird in 1973 ran about 50 cents a pound against nearly $1 for parts, and the carcass went back in for stock afterward, so one chicken was really 3 dinners. The dumpling itself is flour, baking powder, salt, and milk, and it wants to be mixed roughly and left lumpy, because a dough worked smooth goes tough the moment it hits steam. Number 5, ham and bean soup. A leftover ham bone with meat still clinging to it, dried navy beans, and onion and water. The bone is the entire recipe. Everything else is filler around it. A woman bought a ham on a Sunday, served it, and then got 2 more meals out of the bone, and this pot is what made the 3rd one possible without her standing over a stove. The bone is worth being specific about. What you want is the shank bone with the knuckle on it, because the knuckle is joint, and joint is where the gelatin lives. A bone with no joint on it gives you a thinner pot. That is the difference between a soup that coats a spoon and one that does not, and it costs the same either way. Number 6, beef stew. Chuck cut into cubes, potatoes, carrots, onion, a can of tomato, all day on low. The one thing worth knowing is that you brown the beef in a skillet first and then put it in the pot. Everybody skips it because the appliance was sold on not having to, and everybody who skips it gets gray meat in brown water. 4 minutes in a hot pan is the difference between stew and boiled beef. There is a second thing everyone gets wrong, which is putting the potatoes in at the start with the beef. 8 hours turns a potato to mush. They go in for the last 2 hours, and if you are out of the house all day, then you put them in raw and cut them large, because a large chunk survives what a small one will not. Number 7, pinto beans with salt pork, a pound of dry beans, a piece of salt pork, an onion, water, and the whole day. 30 cents fed a family and left enough for the next night. No soaking needed if the pot ran long enough, which is the quiet advantage this appliance had over a stovetop pot that somebody had to watch. Salt pork is worth knowing about because it has almost vanished from ordinary shopping. It is cured fat from the belly or the side. It keeps for months without cold. And a piece the size of a deck of cards will carry a whole pot. It is doing the job a stock cube pretends to do, except it was here first and it costs less. Number 8, stuffed cabbage rolls. Cabbage leaves softened in boiling water, filled with ground beef and rice, rolled, packed tight in the pot with tomato poured over, and left alone. Packing them tight matters. Loose rolls come apart. This was a Sunday dish in a great many immigrant households, and the Crockpot moved it to a Tuesday, which is not a small change in a family's week. There is a shortcut worth having. Freeze the whole head of cabbage overnight and thaw it, and the leaves come away soft and pliable without any boiling at all. Nobody in 1973 had freezer space to spare for that, so they boiled, but you probably do. Number 9, chili. Ground beef browned off, kidney beans, tomato, onion, chili powder all day. What the long cook does is let the chili powder lose its raw edge, which is why a chili made in 30 minutes tastes dusty and one made in 8 hours does not. Same ingredients, entirely different food. The beans are the other argument this dish starts. There are whole counties in Texas where putting a bean in a pot of chili is close to a personal insult, and whole states north of there where a chili without beans would be sent back. In a 1970s household budget, the beans were not optional because the beans are what turned a half-pound of ground beef into dinner for 6. Number 10, chicken cacciatore. Thighs, a jar of sauce or a can of tomatoes, peppers, onion, mushrooms if there were any. This is the 70s discovering that the cheap half of the chicken and a can of tomatoes makes something that tastes like a restaurant, and it went into the rotation of every household in America within about 3 years. We are 10 in, and every one so far has been a cut of meat rescued by time. 10 dishes, and the most expensive ingredient in any of them cost about $1.10 a pound. The next 10 go further than that. These are the pots a woman put on when there was barely any meat in the house at all, when what she had was a bone or a bag of something dried, or the parts of a chicken the butcher was nearly giving away. There is more skill in this half of the list than the first, and less money in it, and those two facts are not a coincidence. And number 25, the last pot on this list, is the one that came to my own table on the worst week we ever had, so stay with me for it. Cacciatore means hunter's style, and the original idea was whatever the hunter came home with, cooked down with whatever was growing. That is exactly the same instinct as every other pot on this list, arriving in an American kitchen with an Italian name on it and a jar of sauce standing in for the garden. Number 11, split pea soup. A pound of split peas, a ham hock, an onion, carrots, water. The peas break down completely and thicken the pot themselves, so there is no flour and no cream anywhere in it. A hock costs almost nothing because it is mostly bone and skin, and it gives up more flavor than a pound of good meat would. Split peas are the one legume that needs no soaking at all, which made this the easiest pot in the whole rotation. A pound cost about $1.25. If yours has ever come out bland, it is because there was no bone in it, and no amount of salt will do what a hock does. Number 12, corned beef and cabbage. A brisket, the cheapest and toughest cut on the animal, cured and then held wet all day until it slices. The cabbage goes in for the last hour only. Put it in at the start and you will have gray ribbons and a smell in the house nobody wants. Brisket is worth understanding because it is the clearest example of everything this pot was for. It is a slab of muscle off the chest of the animal that holds up most of its weight, so it is dense, tough, and threaded through with connective tissue, and no amount of fast cooking will ever make it pleasant. Give it 10 hours of wet, low heat, and it becomes the most tender thing on the table. Number 13, beef tongue. Now here is one people flinch at. Tongue was among the very cheapest things at a butcher counter. It is a single solid muscle with no waste at all, and 8 hours of low wet heat makes it as tender as anything you will ever eat. The skin peels off in one piece when it is done. It vanished from American kitchens in a single generation for no reason other than squeamishness, and the price of that squeamishness was real money out of family budgets. It was also, for a long time, a delicacy rather than a poverty food. It appears on grand hotel menus at the turn of the century. What happened in between is that American shoppers stopped buying anything that still looked like the animal it came from, and the price collapsed, and then the cut disappeared from the case entirely because nobody was asking. Number 14, chicken paprikash, thighs, a great deal of onion, paprika, and sour cream stirred in at the very end off the heat. The sour cream must go in last, and the pot must not boil after it, or it splits. That single instruction is why so many people gave up on this dish. Number 15, pork and sauerkraut, a shoulder, a jar of kraut, an apple cut up all day. The apple is not decoration. The sugar in it takes the sharp edge off the kraut, and pork shoulder was one of the cheapest cuts in the case and remains so. New Year's Day in half the country and a Tuesday in the other half. The tradition of eating it on New Year's Day comes out of German and Pennsylvania Dutch households, where the pig was said to root forward and the cabbage stood for a long green year. Whether you believe any of that or not, it was a cheap shoulder and a jar of something already fermented in the cellar, which is why it survived. Number 16, vegetable beef soup. Whatever was in the crisper drawer going soft, a piece of cheap beef, a can of tomatoes, water. This is not really a recipe at all. It is a method for not throwing food away, which is the reason I wanted it in here. The pot ran all day and absorbed whatever the week had left over. I would tell anybody starting out to keep a bag in the freezer and put every leftover half onion, carrot end, and spoon of corn into it through the week, and then tip the whole bag into the pot on a Sunday with a cheap piece of beef. That was ordinary practice in every kitchen I knew growing up, and it has quietly stopped being taught. Number 17, barbecue pulled pork. A shoulder, an onion, a bottle of sauce, 10 hours, then shredded with 2 forks. A pork shoulder in 1973 ran well under $1 a pound and fed a family for 2 days. Every barbecue restaurant in the country now charges more per sandwich than that whole shoulder cost. Shoulder is the same principle as brisket, and it is even more forgiving. It carries a good deal of internal fat, which means it bastes itself for the whole 10 hours and is nearly impossible to dry out. If you have never cooked one of these, it is the safest, expensive-tasting dinner in this entire list, and it costs less per person than almost anything you can buy ready-made. Number 18, beef stroganoff. Round steak in strips, mushrooms, onion, and sour cream in at the end. Same rule as the paprikash. It was a fancy dish in that decade, the sort of thing a woman made when her husband's supervisor came for dinner, and it was built out of the second cheapest beef in the store. Number 19, chicken and rice. A cut-up bird over rice with soup and water all day. The rice absorbs everything the chicken gives up. This is the single most common weeknight crockpot dinner of the entire decade, and there is a version of it in every community cookbook printed between 1972 and 1980. The one caution is that rice and 8 hours do not get along. If the pot runs all day, the rice will be paste. The women doing this put the rice in for the last hour, or use converted rice which holds its shape, and the community cookbooks almost never say so because everybody already knew. Number 20, lentil soup. Lentils, a bit of bacon or a bone, onion, carrot, water. Lentils needed no soaking and cost less than any other protein in the store per pound. This is the cheapest pot on the list, and it is genuinely good food, which is a combination that does not come up often, 20 inches. What is left is 5 pots that were built out of very nearly nothing, and the last one is the one I said I would come back to. Lentils will also take on whatever you put beside them, which is why every culture that has them has a version of this pot. A bit of bacon makes it American. A spoon of cumin makes it something else entirely. Same legume, same 8 hours, same almost nothing spent. Number 21, hamburger stew, a pound of ground beef, potatoes, carrots, onion, a can of tomato soup, water. Ground beef instead of chuck because ground beef was what was in the freezer, and this was the pot a woman put on when the roast was not in the budget that week, but she still wanted the house to smell like a roast when everybody came in. Tomato soup as an ingredient rather than a meal is one of the signatures of that decade. It was cheap, it was shelf-stable, and it brought acid, sweetness, and body all at once for about a dime. Half the casseroles and a good many of the stews of the 1970s are standing on a can of it. Number 22, chicken necks and backs with dumplings. The parts of the bird that the butcher nearly gave away simmered all day for their broth, the little bit of meat picked off and dumplings dropped on top. Almost no meat at all.